All right, let's do a looping demonstration here in Raptor. So I'm going to look at the end of the Chapter 5 exercises about repetition structures. And again, this is the third edition of the Gaddis book. We're on page 223. And let's do this distance traveled program. So let's see here. The distance a vehicle travels can be calculated as following. Distance is equal to speed times time. Right? For example, if a train travels 40 miles per hour for 3 hours, the distance traveled is 120 miles. Design a program that asks the user for the speed of a vehicle in miles per hour and how many hours it has traveled. It should then use a loop to display the distance the vehicle has traveled for each hour of that time period. Here's an example of the output. So it would ask, what is the speed of the vehicle in miles per hour? And suppose they type in 40. You ask them how many hours has it traveled, and they type in 3. It's going to output a little table here that shows hour 1, 2, and 3, and how many the distance traveled during that time period, or the total distance traveled. All right, so we're going to use a loop to do that. So let's start up Raptor. All right, and before we get too far into it, I just want to remind everybody how we did our loop selection structures. So I reversed the loop logic. So if you haven't done that, by default, the loop logic in Raptor has the loop repeating when the result is no, and exiting when the result is yes. But there's a way to reverse that, and I did a video on how to reverse that. So I'll put a link to that video in the description of this video. So this is how most languages will handle loops, and this is more like a traditional while loop. So as long as this condition is true or yes, it repeats the loop. When the condition is false, it exits out. But before we get into that, I'm going to delete that. Let's handle the input and our variables. So we need a couple of variables here. And actually we need 3, don't we? So the first one, we're going to input the speed of the vehicle. So let's do something like set speed to 0. And then we're going to ask them for the hours traveled. So set, we'll call it time. Set time to 0. And then the third one, this is what a couple things we're going to calculate. The distance. I'll set that to 0. And then in order to do loops, we're going to need a loop variable. So this is a classic counter-controlled loop, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's go ahead and get the input. I'm going to save this first. I'll save this as distance traveled. Oh, I've already done this. Maybe that was a earlier one. Oh, that was from the earlier chapter. Back in chapter 2, maybe. So this is a different variation on that. Yeah. So let me see it. Distance traveled loops. How's that? Okay. So let's get that from the user. Let's do a little separate module for that. Add procedure. Let's name this get input. Yes, we could do it there in main, but we need to get in the habit of doing modules. So we're going to send in the speed, and we're going to send in the time for input and output. Okay, and over here we will have a couple of input statements. So I'm going to say the prompt, enter the, oh, I'll do it like the book. What is the speed of the vehicle in miles per hour? And store that into speed. And the second one, how many hours has it traveled? Store that into time. Okay, let's test that. Oh, I didn't call it. So we have to call that. Call get input, send in speed and time. What is the speed of the vehicle in miles per hour? 50 and 4 hours. Okay, so it looks like it worked. So now we need to set up a loop. We also need to think about our headings for this table, but we can come back and add those. And let's just go ahead and do this loop. Let's go ahead and do it here in the main module. Our focus here is going to be the loop. So I'm going to put the loop in there. Okay. And so this is going to be a classic counter-controlled loop. Every time it goes through, we're keeping count of how many times we've gone through. So we need a loop control variable to keep count, and we don't have one of those yet. So we need one more variable. I'm going to put it up here with the other variables, and I'll name it something like hour counter, and we'll set that to the 0. Okay. Hour counter, and that's going to be our loop control variable. And so let's test on the loop test. As long as hour counter is less than the time, actually it should be should we do less than or equal to? Let's think about, it depends on what we started off at. So I think on this one it probably makes logical sense to start the hour counter off at 1, and we'll do less than or equal to the time. So while hour counter is less than or equal to the time, we're going to repeat. So let's start hour counter off at 1. So we can either start it off at 1 here, or we can put another assignment statement in here. Set hour counter to 1 for the first hour. And these are the 3 parts of most loops, right? You're going to have a loop control variable initialization before the test. Then you're going to have the test, hour counter is less than time. Then you're going to have an update, which we haven't put that in there yet. But let's go ahead and do it without that, and we'll see what happens if we don't have an update. So every time we go through this loop, we want to output a statement. Oh, we want to calculate the distance, right? So an assignment statement goes in here. And so set distance That's the distance traveled to and every time it goes through, it's going to we want to output how far it's gone in that time period. So if we just multiply it times time, that's the total distance, right? We want to output how far it's gone at that point. So we're going to use that hour counter for that. So we'll say speed times hour counter. Distance is equal to speed time times hour counter. And then we can output that. So output hour counter plus some spaces plus the distance, like that. So if we run this, what is the speed of the vehicle? 40. And it's traveled 3 hours, but let's see what happens on our master console. Where is it? Over here. So it just kind of continues to go, right? And that's because we don't have an update of our loop control variable. So our counter is never going up. It's just continuing to stay 1. So this is just going to go on forever. So let's stop it. You can press the stop button. So we need our update. So let's put in an assignment statement, and this goes at the end of your loop. So whatever statements you have inside the loop, this goes at the end. Then you just simply say hour counter. Set hour counter to hour counter plus 1. It's going up by 1 each time. And now when I run that, there's that result, 40, 80, and 120. Let's clear the console. So let's see here. We'll put a call at the beginning. Clear console. Okay. And the only other thing is the heading. So let's put that goes before the loop. You don't want it inside the loop because you don't want the heading to output every time inside the loop. You just want it once. So we'll do that. I'll do that before I set up my loop stuff. So that's just outputting hour and then some spaces and then distance traveled. And if you want that like a dashed line underneath there, you can output that as well. A separate output statement for that. We'll probably have to do some trial and error to get things to look right. I'm going to do 50 and 6 hours. So there it goes. Let's get rid of some of the dashes and maybe put a few more spaces in there. Here. add a few more of the dashes back. All right, so there you go. And in the book, technically, they show the numbers right aligned, but I'm just going to go with that. So that's an example of how you can write a little program using loops in Raptor.